Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Saturday, February 8th, 2025, and you are listening to The Rundown, or watching The Rundown, my sometimes weekly podcast where I talk about all things video games, sometimes anime, sometimes general pop culture related nonsense. And boy, oh boy, do we have a episode in store for you today. At least I do, since I'm the one-man show doing this podcast thing and whatnot. Speaking of, I'm your host, Corrupt Ronan, as always. Running the show here. One sec as we have this going on at the same time. That was rather quick. Anyways. So, like I said, we got an episode in store for you today, and I got a lot of stuff to talk about that relates to all kinds of gaming drama that has happened over the past few days, or the past week, I guess you could say in this case. So, to give you an idea of what we're going over in this episode, first up, we have Ghost of Yotei drama, and I'll be going over much of the information about that and how that relates to a previous video I made in regards to Ghost of Yotei and I guess you could say the response I got from the general audience in regards to that video and how I'm feeling quite a bit vindicated now considering what's going on with that. So that's on the docket for news today. Also, and how that is somehow related to a lot of the stuff that's happened at BioWare with Dragon Age the Veilguard, and how that's also connected to some rather out of touch and completely tone deaf comments out of the CEO at EA during an earnings call. And that's a whole mess in itself. How the previous director of Dragon Age the Veilguard and their new antics and what they're getting up to now since the departure from BioWare and the subsequent layoffs that came with it. Also, there's some news about the CEO of CI Games, or Psy Games, we'll call it, and how he was basically banned from his own game's subreddit. Why? We'll get into details about that later as well. Plus, there's more news, and unfortunately, as I try to do my best to keep a lot of this stuff as not political as I possibly can, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go down that route because what has happened over the past week, it is kind of unavoidable because of the amount of reach this has and the implications it has. So I'm going to have to get a little political towards the end of this episode. So just brace yourselves for that. Also, by the way, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Obviously, like I said before, I'm still trying to figure my way out around this whole YouTube thing, but I do understand that likes and subscriptions are indeed a way to help support a channel and even videos and help them reach more eyes and ears, so on and so forth. So if you haven't done that already, if you're watching on YouTube, whether you're watching it live or the VOD version, and you have the patience for it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. That being said, without further ado, let's get into it. So, I put out a video back in September talking about Ghost of Yotei once the game was revealed. And based off of the information surrounding that game that had come out, whether it be about the game's protagonist and the actress that they use, actress in this case that they use for the character model for the game, and her political leanings, and how people are basically concerned because of that in itself. And when I put that video out and talked about how people were justified in being apprehensive, concerned, cautious, I said they were justified in doing so. And of course, that sparked quite a bit of a discussion in the comments. Of course, people saying, oh, well, you don't know that that's going to be the case for this game, or it's going to be woke because of the actor alone. Like, the actor doesn't have any influence or say of what's happening in the game's content. And from what I saw, the developers of this game are still the developers of the first game, so I can't see how that would change. And you're just wrong about that. Like, you guys are just overbearing, and while I don't like the heavy-handed politics in games, I think this is going too far. So I said, fair. But then news started hitting about the game from insiders. Without further ado, let me point you to Exhibit A. We got an article from That Park Place here. And this is going to be fun for all of you watching right now. The article is titled, Ghost of Yotei fan concerns increase. Games writers also worked on Dragon Age The Veilguard and Mass Effect Andromeda. Let's continue. It says Sucker Punch's upcoming Ghost of Yotei is already facing serious backlash, and now new details have emerged that only add fuel to the fire. According to IMDb, the game's writers include John Dumbrow and Courtney Woods, both whom worked on Dragon Age The Veilguard, a game widely criticized for prioritizing identity politics over compelling storytelling. This revelation, concerns that Ghost of Yotei is shaping up to be another woke disaster have only intensified. The controversy surrounding Ghost of Yotei began with its very first trailer, where fans quickly realized that instead of continuing the story of Jin Sakai, the beloved protagonist of Ghost of Tsushima, Sucker Punch replaced him with a new female lead named Atsu. This abrupt shift in focus immediately raised red flags for gamers wary of yet another classic franchise being retooled for modern ideological messaging. These are some of the social media posts from Erika Ishii, who is the actress and the face and model that they use for the game, for the characters, for the main protagonist. That all depends how you feel about that shit. I'm not going to go into that. That's all about your own political leanings, but let's just put it this way. And this is where the concerns come into play. Typically, a studio would want to stay away from people that are considered radioactive or incendiary like this because they don't want the drama. When you go out of your way to continue to do that, regardless of what the drama is or how radioactive that person might be, you are making it very clear that you condone the things that are said, the actions that they took, and the stances that they take. Let me continue. Making matters worse in the eyes of many fans, the game's protagonist is played by Erika Ishii, a radical progressive, blah, blah, blah. We're going to talk about that. On top of that, Sucker Punch hired Thomas Hart as its new community manager in April 2024. Hart, formerly of Insomniac Games, has openly defended Sweet Baby Inc., the controversial consulting firm known for injecting divisive identity politics into games. Just a month before joining Sucker Punch, Hart had dismissed concerns over Sweet Baby Inc.'s influence. So you got that whole aspect of it, too. Of course, Sweet says, the whole Sweet Baby controversy is mind-numbingly dumb, he said. Most people have no idea how games are made or what a consultant does. Many don't even care to listen when someone tries to explain it to them. They'd much rather have it other to demonize. Of course, as time went on, we found out that Sweet Baby Inc. does indeed do what gamers had thought that they did. But there's even more details about that unfortunately I'm not going to be able to go over in this episode because of the amount of stuff that's been happening in the news over the week. On top of that, where there was one video that came out by a content creator who talks about Sweet Baby Inc. and says that we don't exactly know what Sweet Baby Inc. does, but that there is potential for them to not necessarily be a consultancy firm, but a gateway to receive funding from investors that want developers to put effectively DEI content in their games. And that the only way they would get the funding from it is that they have a firm like Sweet Baby Inc. in their studio working with them on the game. That's the whole thing in itself. Anyways, this is from Courtney Woods. Since I'm so excited to announce today my first day as senior staff writer at Sucker Punch Productions. Can't wait to work with the team and learn from my incredibly talented coworkers. This is a dream come true. Now, for me, my thing is they haven't specifically said that both Courtney and Thomas are working on Ghost of Tsushima or Ghost of Yotei right now. But on top of the fact that I also believe that much of the game story is already complete, especially if they're aiming to have the game out by sometime this year. Maybe by fall this year, maybe by the summer. So I imagine the main story content for that is either done or close to being done. And if that's the case, then I can't imagine these writers really having a lot of influence over the game's main story. However, they may have some influence over the game's content like additional side characters, side quests, mechanics, so on and so forth. So I would not be surprised if you see any of that stuff in the side content instead, because a lot of the side content ends up getting done after the main story is done. Says it's important to note that both Ghost of Yotei writers have had some successes under their belts. Wood's track record also includes Star Wars The Old Republic, Dragon Age Inquisition, while Dumbrow, hopefully I'm saying Dumbrow right, I don't know if I'm butchering the name, I apologize, previously worked on Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3. These are all successful and widely regarded titles, which is true. And that goes back into the whole idea of people trying to come after me in the comments of the previous video saying that, oh, well, it's the same people, so I don't understand why it would be any worse. It's a I understand how that would be a change or a clear indication that the game is going to be woke. And what people fail to realize in regards to this particular topic, and the whole idea of the same people working on a project does not equate to things not changing, stories not changing, and the entire messaging of a game not changing because it's the same people. It's kind of ridiculous because it completely ignores the fact that it's been 5 years since the first Ghost of Tsushima. Okay, 5 years since then. It also completely ignores the fact that humans, people, us, we change every day. Our mindsets change, the things we think about change, the things we do change. It takes one day for that to happen. People can change over a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, a month, several months. So if that's the case, and it's very clear that people can change over the course, an entire studio can change over the course of 5 years, even if the same people are there. Take Suicide Squad, for example. Now, a lot of people tend to rest what happened with Suicide Squad at the feet of Sweet Baby Inc. And while they definitely are to blame for much of the game's failure in terms of its writing and so on, I would argue that even if Sweet Baby Inc. wasn't there, the story would still be full of that heavy-handed political ideology messaging. Why? Because the people within the studio are already knee-deep in that shit to begin with. Why? Because it would take you having the mindset of that ilk to want to hire a studio like Sweet Baby Inc. in the first place. When the goals and ideologies align, then it all works out. So even if SBI wasn't there, there was still a very high possibility that would have been the case. So there was a whole thing of people trying to rest a lot of this stuff at Sweet Baby Inc.'s feet. And while it is true they've definitely had influence in that regard, and I'm still fully willing to blame SBI for a lot of what's been going on in video games these days, especially at the studios that they've worked with, I wouldn't rest it solely at their feet because it takes the mindset of an entire studio to align with that to want to hire them in the first place. You look at Spider-Man 2018 to Spider-Man 2, which came out in 2023, right? There is a remarkable change in terms of how the story is told in Spider-Man 2 versus 2018's game. Keep in mind that the majority of people that worked on Spider-Man 2018 also worked on Spider-Man 2. But it is very clear that the quality of the story in Spider-Man 2 is far inferior to that of 2018's story. It's not just Sweet Baby Inc. It's the entire studio because it takes the studio mindset to align with a company like that to want to hire them in the first place. Which leads back into this. There has been no proof whatsoever, at least so far, that any of these consultancy firms out there like a SBI or a Baby Ghost or whatever it might be out there that are working with Sucker Punch on Ghost of Yotei. Nothing so far. And there's a chance that there might not be a consultancy firm whatsoever that works on the game in that regard. But there is still a very high chance that the game will still be wrapped in a lot of, for lack of a better way to describe it, woke ideology. Because if your studio is already full of those people to begin with, you don't need a consultancy firm to have that kind of influence. A lot can change in 5 years. Even if it's the same people, because people can change a lot in 5 years. Especially when over the past 5 years, all they've ever seen on social media and news outlets, and even being required to within the studios, be forced to, quote unquote, acknowledge their privilege and feel bad for the color of their skin and whatever's going on between their legs. That is how this stuff happens. So, yes, people were justified back then for being concerned and apprehensive. And now they should feel quite a bit vindicated about why. Now, does that mean that the game is for sure going to be full of this woke shit when it comes out? Absolutely not. But people have even more reason to be concerned that it might be. And I don't think people realize just how tired of this stuff the general public really is. You hear a lot of people on social media being tired of it, but not everybody is on social media. The extent to which people are fed up with this shit runs deeper than you think. But on the topic of basically EA people and BioWare people moving over to other studios and Dragon Age Veilguard being the complete shit show that it was, we're gonna skip over the this one. I'll come back to that because it kind of wraps back into this. EA continues to reveal just how out of touch they are when it comes to the failure of Dragon Age the Veilguard. When its CEO, Andrew Wilson, decided to say that it was the lack of live service elements in the game for the reason why the game underperformed in terms of sales. This man literally blamed it on the lack of live service elements in the game. Now, to be fair, insiders had come out and talked about how the game was originally supposed to be a live service game. They had planned it to be a live service game in the beginning. So I'm kind of not surprised that he fell back on the idea of, well, maybe we should have just stuck with the live service thing and maybe that would have been successful. The whole idea of, well, we should have just stuck with our gut feeling, went with the first one, which is a awful thing to say in this climate, especially when you see places like Sony, for example, which have canceled multiple live service projects, including a live service God of War, which no one asked for. But let's see what he said exactly. Let's read the article. Last week, publisher Electronic Arts mentioned that BioWare's latest game, Dragon Age: The Veilguard, missed sales projections by a whopping 50%. Was the game's lackluster performance due to a bad story, outdated gameplay mechanics? Apparently, it was because it wasn't a live service game. It says this was something mentioned by CEO Andrew Wilson in the publisher's latest quarterly earnings report. Since in the earnings report, Wilson mentioned Dragon Age had a high quality launch and was well reviewed by critics and those who played. Now, anybody who was paying attention to the reviews that came out with Dragon Age: The Veilguard when it launched, they will tell you that the reviews were suspect to begin with, because in nearly every review, there was the quote, a return to form for BioWare in nearly every review for the game, which made people very suspicious about whether or not those reviews were bought and paid for. Says, however, it did not resonate with a broad enough audience in this highly competitive market. Now, many people would argue that one of the major reasons the game failed was because it was trying to appeal to a broad enough audience. I was watching a video by, I believe his name is A:TV. He's a content creator on YouTube, so shout out to him. He does pretty good work. And he had an insider at Ubisoft reach out to him talking about, Assassin's Creed Shadows and basically the general fall of Ubisoft. And one thing that this insider pointed out that makes a hell of a lot of sense when you really think about it is that one of the reasons why a lot of games have been failing lately is because they're trying to appeal to a broader audience, and why this is a backwards line of thinking, because it is not the broader audience that is going out of their way to find and buy these games. When you break it down to how games typically gain traction and popularity, Basically, it is the core audience, or you can even call them the hardcore audience, of gamers that are always tuned in to what's going on with video games and the industry as a whole. Those are the people that when they find a game that they really like and is really good, they start talking about it. And then the people on the outside who don't really pay attention that much to video games, not really tuned into the news like that, they tune in and listen to the core gamers to find out what's popular, and then they buy based off what the core audience is talking about. So this appeal to the broader audience first was already a foolhardy thing to begin with. So it's because you were trying to reach a broad enough audience, appeal to an audience that just wasn't there. You ended up alienating your core audience. And when the core audience said, yo, this game is trash, the broad audience started seeing that people were calling it trash and they didn't want it either. And that's how you end up with a game that underperforms significantly. On top of the fact that their expectations for and sales projections for the game were completely unrealistic. They were hoping for that game to reach 10 million in sales by the end of the year 2024. Just a few months. The game came out in November. So the expectations there were already unrealistic to begin with. On top of the fact of you creating a game that appealed to no one. Like, have we forgotten the fact that with the very first trailer they showed for the Veilguard, people were already vehemently against? They hated everything about it, the way it looked, the tone, the art style, all of it. There were so many memes made from the first trailer alone. The game was practically destined to fail. And somehow your conclusion to all of that was the fact that it wasn't a live service game? Now, perhaps, maybe he was just trying to save face in front of investors. Maybe he thought, and this is me giving him a lot of benefit of the doubt, of him trying to save face by saying, perhaps the lack of live service elements was the reason why it failed, even though we internally at EA know why it failed. We just can't say that for fear of a wide amount of backlash that would come from us saying, like, yo, it was the woke bullshit we pushed in the game for the reason why it failed. There's a lot of studios that are afraid to say that because I think they're going to get a lot of backlash for saying that. And to be fair, they will get some form of backlash, but it won't be to the degree that they think they're getting it. Because that audience doesn't really exist like that. Goes on to say our blockbuster storytelling strategy is built on three strategic objectives. First, create an authentic story experience for the core audience. Second, build innovative groundbreaking features. And third, emphasize high quality launches across both PC and console, Wilson shares. So even your principles, you went against even your own principles because you didn't even create the game for the core audience. The core audience didn't like it either. Adding to that, in order to break out beyond the core audience, games need to directly connect to the evolving demands of players who increasingly seek shared world features and deeper engagement alongside high-quality narratives in this beloved category. Shared world features means online features, as in a live service. So with that being said, people are now concerned about the future of Mass Effect because that is the next project they're working on right now. Keep in mind, this is in lieu of them laying off well over 100 people at BioWare since the failure of the Veilguard. And BioWare is now operating with, I wouldn't call it a skeleton crew, but a fraction of the size they once had. And maybe that's for the best because over the past 5 years, it has been proven that a lot of these studios, in terms of headcount, are extremely bloated. And many of the people that are there in many of these studios don't necessarily need to be there. And that a lot of them can get by with a much lower headcount and still make amazing quality experiences at the same time. So perhaps it's for the best, but the way this guy's talking, especially to his investors about live service mechanics, people are concerned about Mass Effect, and I kind of am too. Hopefully it doesn't go down that route, because at least I'll speak in my case, I would hate to see a live service Mass Effect game. Sure as hell don't need that. Especially at a time where people are most certainly sick of live service games. To the point where even Sony canceled. As you can see, the companion article here of Sony canceling live service projects. Because even they figured it out. So we'll see where that shit goes in the future, but that does not paint a particularly great picture for EA and BioWare and Mass Effect going into the future. Like you said, the Mass Effect co-op thing, multiplayer thing was fine. So never buy a game built around that. Yeah, like the multiplayer component thing in Mass Effect 3 was fine. A lot of people played that. And that was constantly updated with new maps and stuff like that. In a degree that you could kind of call a live service, even though it actually wasn't necessarily a live service. And I don't think people would object to them bringing something like that back for the next Mass Effect. My only problem with that multiplayer mode is because in the beginning, that mode was very intrinsically linked to the story of the single player portion of Mass Effect 3, where if you wanted to have the appropriate level of galactic battle readiness for the end of the game, you had to have played a decent portion of the multiplayer to have that number go up. So if they do bring that back, I do not want that to be so linked to the story that you have to play it in order to make any real progress or get any particular endings at the game. Nancy says they cancel so hard PSN is down. It's been down for over a day now. Like, hopefully we're not going back to that the infamous 2011 PlayStation Network outage where it was down for like a month. That was some funny shit, but a lot of people were real pissed off. Hopefully we're not back to that era of things. Anyways, I guess I might as well get this whole BioWare and Dragon Age thing out of the way, so I'll just stick on this topic for now. But our next story here is, I have said time and time again that people in the industry, whether they make a good game or not, or a game that just completely flounders, somehow, even when they get laid off, they somehow still manage to fail upwards. Which brings us to our next story here. From thatparkplace.com, we have an article titled, "The Veilguard director, Corinne Bush, hired by Wizards of the Coast for Skeleton Key Studios after leaving BioWare." Now, for those who don't know, Wizards of the Coast is the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons. Which means that whatever Skeleton Key is working on is most likely related to D&D. So when Corinne left and said that they were leaving to go work on a dream RPG, this is what they meant. In a move that sparked immediate controversy and proved that it's more than possible to fail upwards in the gaming world, Wizards of the Coast has reportedly hired Dragon Age: The Veilguard director Corinne Bush to work at its newly formed Skeleton Key Studios. Its development, first reported by Diversity and Dragons, we'll talk about that in a minute, and later confirmed by YouTuber Smash18, suggests that the Veilguard director has quietly landed a new role despite producing the most notorious bomb in BioWare's long-running RPG history. You still don't think people fail up in the industry? You still don't think there's a level of nepotism in the industry? Hive-minded mentality? Where no matter what happens, people still manage to move upward? One of the few industries where no matter how good or how bad you do, you are rewarded for it regardless. Now, this could be a case of them bringing Corinne on for the sake of, well, in terms of what the critics thought Veilguard was amazing, so we're going to bring you on so you can make an amazing game for us too. The problem is, the critics, the access media, they've lost a lot of influence over the past 5 years. where many people generally do not care what critics think or Access Media thinks when it comes to video games. Because they know now that they don't have the gamer's best interest at heart. So whether the critics think the game is good or not is irrelevant these days. Because in many cases, the critics are not the ones buying the games. They typically get the codes for free. You're not making money off of the critics, you're making money off of the gamers. The people that actually put money down have an actual investment into the game you just made. People that have real skin in the game. So if you're hiring based off of that, then you can expect to see more studios and more games failing. Now, some studios have been quietly making changes behind the scenes. You take Suicide Squad and Rocksteady, for example. Obviously, Suicide Squad was a colossal failure for Rocksteady and Warner Brother Games. $200 million in the hole, right? Since then, there have been rumors that Rocksteady was now working on a new single-player Batman game. And that has now been confirmed. The problem is that current Rocksteady is the same Rocksteady that worked on Suicide Squad. And I don't know about you, but after having played a good portion of Suicide Squad and finding out that I did not care for it whatsoever, after seeing all the memes and the poor writing in the game, do you still want that Rocksteady to work on another Batman game? To continue to shit all over Batman's legacy the way they did in Suicide Squad? Because it was very clear that at the end of the main story in Suicide Squad, they made it very clear how they felt about Batman in general. Do you really want that same studio to work on another Batman game? Because I don't know about you, but the last thing I want is for Batman to drop to his knees and complain about his white privilege in any cutscene. So yeah, you have it. This came from an insider over at Skeleton Key and at Wizards of the Coast. They posted a picture showing that, indeed, Corinne Bush had been added as game director at the studio. The fact that this stuff is coming out in the first place from insiders goes to show that there's a lot of people in game studios these days that do not agree with a lot of the heavy-handed politics that are coming out of video games. And the problem is that because these studios are so enraptured in this shit, and the higher-ups are so knee-deep in it, that they can't speak out publicly against it without fear of losing their jobs. And worse, because like I said before, the industry is built on such deeply entrenched rot and nepotism that if they were to say something, they would be blacklisted from the entire industry. They would make sure that whoever said anything against what's happening right now, they would never find work in the industry ever again. So the only thing they can do is to reach out to content creators and say, this is what's going on. And they have to do so under anonymity and ensure that no one ever finds out who they are so they don't lose their jobs. That's where we're at now. And you can tell this image was taken from somebody's like phone and sent to someone. Speaking of upsetting the hive mind, there's another fun part about this, and I mentioned this earlier during the rundown for the show notes. So, I mentioned earlier that there was a developer, or rather a CEO, at Psy Games who has come under fire from Reddit to the point where they banned him and his team from the game's own subreddit. Comes from one Marek Tominsky. believe his name is. Hopefully I'm not butchering that. I gotta scroll back up real quick. So he is the CEO of CI Games, or CI Games Official. And recently what he took to social media to basically send out a bunch of polls and get people's general ideas or the general temperature of what gamers want in video games moving forward. Since that happened, and here we go. Since that happened, Reddit, the game's subreddit, took to banning him from it. And here's a post from the game's subreddit right now. This announcement addressing the CEO of CI Games' politically motivated agenda. Direct links to X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are no longer permitted. It says, opening thoughts. The CEO of CI Games, Marek Tymiński, hopefully I'm saying that right, probably butchering that, and I apologize, is actively supporting and promoting fascist ideology under the guise of catering to the player base. You might be thinking, what in the world is this fascist ideology? Let me show you. Asking players if Souls-like RPGs should have invasions be optional or mandatory. Or better yet, how about another one? Another poll. Should Souls-like games have difficulty modes? Obviously, people said that they shouldn't. And back to the previous poll, they said they should let players choose whether or not they want evasions or not, which I agree with. I also agree with this one. No, keep them as they are. Or how about another poll? How should attractive lead female characters look in an action RPG? Majority of people said, I'm just here for the gameplay. Second to that was sexy and proactive. So a good portion of people out there still want their characters to look attractive. Or another poll. How should attractive lead male characters look in action RPGs? Majority of people said rugged and badass. Second to that was, I'm just here for the gameplay. So by all means, feel free to tell me, as I consider myself to definitely not be the smartest man in the world, feel free to tell me where the fascist ideology is in these polls. Can anyone tell me that? Anybody? Chat? You see it? Yet, they accuse him of doing that on the game's own subreddit. You know, people, I always make it a case all the time. How much I cannot stand social media. There was a point in time where I tried my best to get into social media, but then as time went on and I saw the level of just absolute mental derangement that infests all social media platforms, whether it be Reddit, Reddit, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. The amount of mental derangement and rot that infests all these platforms, I started seeing that, and I wanted no part of it. And I am continued to be shown just how much I do not want to be part of it when you start seeing shit like this. People who get all up in arms over a guy who just made a bunch of polls asking what people wanted to see in the games. That's it. That's all he did. And I thought, well, maybe he was saying a bunch of wild shit in his tweets. But I have yet to see any of that. Like, oh, you might hate Joe Rogan. Oh, it's a big deal. Didn't realize he didn't like Joe Rogan, but oh, big deal. I have yet to see anything absolutely wild in any of his Twitter posts. Outside of talking about Lords of the Fallen, sales. So where is it coming from? Where is it coming from? Now, obviously, he caught wind of this, started talking about it. He says, the everyone is a Nazi thing is getting really boring and out of touch. Truth always wins in the end. Trust is built through authenticity and transparency, not by shifting narratives. Players first. Another part of that says, I took screenshots of all the comments before they started getting deleted on that Reddit Nazi post. almost all the comments were against the ban or calling me a Nazi, which must have triggered them to start deleting the posts. It says, we have everything. The truth always wins. Yes, indeed. When this whole thing went up, there were a lot of people on that subreddit that were calling the moderators absolutely insane for doing this. And they started deleting those posts, banning people from the subreddit because they said that. So when you get called out by your own community for your insane takes and actions of banning the CEO from the subreddit of his own game, and even locking the comments so no one can express dissenting opinions whatsoever. You see down at the bottom, it says, we'd like to clarify that the developers have only been removed from the mod team. You took away all their powers. All because you falsely accused, without any evidence, of him promoting fascist ideology. No evidence, by the way. Just polls. Absolutely insane. Could it be the fact that when you actually take players' opinions into consideration, you find that players are the opposite of what the particular narrative that has been pushed for the past 5 years is telling us? When you keep telling all these developers that players don't want to see attractive women in video games, that's ridiculous. They're tired of the male gaze and sexy female characters. When you've been hearing that from quote unquote consultants for the past 5 years, and then when someone decides, you know what, I'm actually going to ask the players myself what they want to see, and they find that the opposite of that is true, is that why you're so upset? Because they turned on the lights finally and saw the roaches scattering? For the long time, people said that they don't care about attractive characters in video games. No, they do. They absolutely do. Hell, outside of the gameplay, the second and third place of this particular poll is classy and beautiful and sexy and provocative. So to sit there and pretend that they don't care is ridiculous. Same thing with the male characters. They wanted rugged and badass. Yeah, people do care about the appearances of the lead characters in the video games. 100%. But if you have these people tell it to you, that's not what's happening. But these are the same people that'll say that 60% of gamers are female. Yeah, it was like, 50% of gamers are female. These are the same people that will tell you that and run with that like it's actually true, and it's not. In fact, this is me bringing this stuff off the cuff. Actually, this is me going off the cuff here for the off the show notes. There was a poll conducted by Nintendo not long ago where they basically got the demographics of their particular user base, or their user base for the Switch, and they found. I wish I had that graph on hand so I could pull it up for you guys, but very similar to the Capcom infograph that I showed not long ago, is that the majority of the gamers that are playing games on Switch are all male. I think it was like 20 or 13% female. Like, people keep making these claims that 50% of gamers are females, and when you actually run the numbers, actually start polling people on what's going on, you find a very different story. So all this stuff for DEI and wokeness in video games, so on and so forth, I said it time and time again, This stuff was built on a heap of lies to push a very specific agenda. Now, let me just go back over here real quick as I ready this extra bit of news here. Did I save that? Hopefully I saved that. I want to say it. Sweet. I saved that. Did I save that? Oh, yeah, I did. So I talked a little bit about Sweet Baby Inc. early on and talked about how we may still have it a little bit wrong about what they do, about what they actually do when it comes to video games, right? So I can probably try to pull this up real quick. It's going to take me a moment, so just... Okay, there we go. So I have this video that I want to talk about real quick, and hopefully the audio will work this time and me not having to fix it, but I might still have to fix it. Hopefully I don't. This video comes from A:TV, the guy I mentioned earlier. And he talks a little bit about the Sweet Baby Inc. and what their purpose is. Make sure the volume's working real quick.
One of the AAA studios.
Oh God, I'm getting echo. Hold on. Time out. I'm getting echo. Let's go ahead and kill that on my side real quick. It's always an audio issue, man. It's always an audio issue. There we go. All right, let's see what
more of these are going to close. Need any more? So they were forced to get jobs outside of the industry, and for a lot of them, it's better than what happens inside. Are now literally closing under Trump, and a lot in the way that you need help on the narrative, and therefore you get consulted what you think they do.
There we go.
DI and woke stuff in video games. And they say to me, it's consulting firms like SBI. And I was, well, yeah, of course, but why go after these firms? Like, what is the point? And, well, SBI and these companies don't do what you think they do. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said,
now this is him talking to his insider that obviously he can't say who the insider is. He did mention early in the video that this insider has worked on a AA game. And he pointed to an image. I can pull that up. Here we go. He says that the insider had worked on, let's just say, one of these games in this list. Wouldn't say exactly which one it was, but you have to think AA studio, and maybe you'll figure it out. But anyways.
Funding. Companies don't do what you think they do. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said, well, okay, so in order to understand this, SBI doesn't consult on the narrative in the way that you need help on the narrative, and therefore you get consultants in. You need funding. And SBI is connected to funds, lots of it, specifically ESG funding. SBI can connect you to all of the biggest ESG investors out there, but you need them in order to get to these funds, because these funds will only invest in things that are ESG and DEI safe. And so if you want the funds, you have to have them consult on your narrative. And this is where it sort of became clear to me. So when developers say, no one forced us to make the game woke, they're absolutely not lying. They were not forced. They were kindly reminded that if you want the funds to actually make your game, you do what we say. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't negotiate. You can absolutely say, well, we don't actually want to make this character this way or this character this way. What if we add another character? The point is they have certain checklists, certain minimum requirements that they need in your game in order for your game to be considered DEI. And apparently also these metrics are not the same for every company.
There were a lot of people out there when this stuff first started coming out saying that, oh, these people are lying. There isn't a checklist going on in the studios about what they have to fulfill. They don't have to check off a bunch of boxes. This isn't true. That's not true. It's just a bunch of conspiracy theories. After listening to what he said, watching this video last night, and hearing that there is indeed a checklist, I was also reminded of something else that happened recently that was based on something not meeting a checklist. For those of you who haven't been paying attention, and for those of you who haven't, the news came out that Sonic 3 was disqualified from the Oscars because it wasn't diverse enough, quote unquote. They disqualified Sonic 3 from winning any Oscar because it wasn't diverse enough. If you can believe that. Now, a few years back, people had done some digging about the Oscars and its requirements when it comes to people actually being nominated and winning Oscars. And they found that indeed, yes, there is a checklist that people have to meet for diversity standards to be considered for Oscars. So this idea that this whole DEI thing, whether it be in movies or video games, that there isn't a checklist, it's a load of horseshit. There's absolutely a checklist. There's absolutely requirements that you have to meet. I've said time and time again that we do not understand just how deep the rot goes in video games. And the truth is, we really don't. We think we have an idea, but I've said time and time again that this rot runs far deeper than we ever anticipated.
So HBI will use big studios and then provide minimal requirements so that their name can be attached to these big studios, so they can take those big studios and hoard it over smaller studios. Goes, see what we did with these games? Now look, imagine what we can do for you. Right? So HBI plays a very interesting little grifting game, effectively, but it's not what it says on the tin. When you go,
and I kind of want to add on to that, because what people tend to find interesting is how SBI keeps getting contracts with these larger studios, even though the things they talk about and how they want to and the stuff they want to promote in games really isn't all that popular. You take the GLAAD Awards that I talked about in a previous episode many months back, and how they had a YouTube channel for their GLAAD Awards, which was basically the awards that are given to developers and stuff for basically the LGBTQ representation stuff in their video games. But you found that when you go to these videos, you find that many of these videos are barely breaking 1,000 views. And yet somehow they're getting sponsorships for tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why? Because this stuff is built off of a foundation even of just flat out lies.
Go over to HBI's website and you look at this, where they say script writing, consultation, authenticity, sensitivity, feature project. This is not what they do. They connect you to funding. That's why so many of the AA studios, and this developer specifically knows of AA studios that are in bed with HBI, and they can't get out. There's no way to get out of it, because you're basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either tell HBI, get the hell out of here, we don't want your services anymore, and then you're not making a game at all because the funding dries up immediately, or you take your chances with HBI. So you basically bet that you are one of those companies that can pull out a Baldur's Gate 3, including all of the woke narrative elements, but still make a good, decent game. And hopefully it still sells really well. The problem, of course, is that most developers are not talented enough to do that. Most writers cannot write that well. And so most of these stories just absolutely fall flat. But this is their main drive. This is the main reason SBI exists. Like I said, I didn't plan on this being a big sort of bombshell interview. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the behind the scenes of the industry. And then they said this to me and I was like, what? Oh, that's insane. Like, I always knew that it was connected to funding, but the way I thought of it was they want ESG funds. In order to be ESG compliant, they have.
Yeah, that's kind of what it is. And there's a lot of these major studios out there that are basically catering to this idea of being ESG compliant. And one of those things to meet that is meeting DEI requirements. And you can find this stuff on most of the major publishers' corporate websites. There is something about ESG and DEI in nearly every one of these publishers' corporate websites. Even though there's been a very clear concerted effort and pushback against all of this shit in all games. Hell, even all forms of entertainment at this point, because movies are suffering from it too. There was always a talk that this stuff had influence before, but when you keep hearing developers come out and talk about it and basically confirming what a lot of us had been suspecting over the past year and a half now, since what people are calling quote unquote Gamergate 2.0 or whatever started happening back in March of last year. This is like you're getting behind the scenes. You're getting the actual people behind the scenes working on the games telling you what's going on. And it's unfortunate because this is the grift they need to ensure that no matter how many studios they tank and how many people get laid off from bad projects, places like SBI will continue to exist. But there is more to this than even that. And that's where, like I said at the beginning, unfortunately, I'm going to have to get a bit political because this is, I want to say it's big, but perhaps it's even bigger than I'm letting on. But we'll continue. So, over the past few days, or perhaps even the day and a half, you might have heard some stuff about the USAID stuff going on, right? And regardless of how you feel about the whole USAID thing and whether or not it just exists or be cut or whatever it might be, it's kind of irrelevant, at least in this case. Because in doing so, when they were digging through a lot of the USAID stuff, they found out that a lot of government funds, or at least government money, I should say, maybe not funds itself, based on some of the additional research that has come out since then, but a lot of government money has exchanged hands with a website called Politico. Now, how does this relate to video games? Well, for the past 10 years, websites like Politico, New York Times, the list goes on, have consistently published articles, no matter how unrelated they may be. In every one of these articles, they would somehow link it back to Gamergate of 2014 and say that every bad thing that happens to, whether it be a woman or somebody or some sort of tragic event that happens, they would find some way to link it back to Gamergate or accuse Gamergate of being the culprit of this thing happening. Oh, Donald Trump got elected in 2016, Gamergate. Taylor Swift gets harassed, Gamergate. The list goes on. And people found that when you type Gamergate in on the website, that you pull up at least 22 articles that may not have Gamergate in the title, but there is Gamergate mentioned in the article somewhere. And it's funny having seen this now because a few years ago, I watched a video from a content creator, I believe his name is Upper Echelon Gaming. And I watch it from time to time because he has some pretty deep dives in a lot of stuff that goes on, whether it be in video games or even our own government, for example. He does a lot of deep dives about that stuff. And what he found, this was a few years ago, mind you, what he found was that there were a lot of websites up there that were basically using Gamergate as the quote-unquote boogeyman for a lot of the major negative events that were happening in the country, and even the world for that matter. Now, for those who don't know, the whole thing with Gamergate is that back in 2014, it started off as a movement for ethics in journalism. Basically, there was the whole thing with Zoe Quinn that happened back then and how she was effectively sleeping with reviewers to ensure that her game got a positive or a high score. This wasn't rumor, this was proven. Okay? And when people found out about that, they realized that, yeah, people are basically massaging quote unquote, we'll call it, their ways into getting good reviews for games. And it caused people to be really, really upset about this because this ensured that there was basically the ethics and integrity in journalism was basically gone. What was it? Depression Quest, I think it was, that she made back then. And yeah, it came out that she was sleeping with reviewers to get good reviews for that game. And people called the industry out for that shit. And they started demanding ethics in journalism because they saw the shit as this is being disruptive. Of course, what ended up happening was a lot of people in Access Media who were on her side, they decided they wanted to hijack what the movement was and try to label it as a harassment campaign instead, basically trying to take the wind out of the sails of what Gamergate was trying to do back then. So now when you type in Gamergate these days, all you ever hear about is about it being a harassment campaign. Even if you were to type it up and look it up on websites like Wikipedia, for example, they would call it a misogynist, white supremacist hate campaign. So why is Politico important in this case? Why is it such a big deal that Politico was the one pushing stuff like this? It's because Politico is a website that a lot of major news media networks source for a lot of their info. Anywhere from your MSNs to your CNNs to your CBSs, your MSNBCs, they all use Politico as a source for much of their information. And they relay that back to you, the people watching it. So basically, what's being said in this case from a lot of people is that a lot of government funds were effectively being used to make gamers the analogous to actual terrorists. And whether it be our taxpayer dollars or not, so far it seems to be, based off of the info that I've seen so far, is that they didn't actually use actual taxpayer dollars for this. But the government was still funding the website to make articles like this. And this runs deeper than just Politico. This goes into things like the ADL, for example, which continues to put out articles trying to ridicule Steam for being an anti-Semitic platform based off of very poor research. And I talked about this in a previous episode when they tried to claim that the Pepe Frog was a symbol of anti-Semitism and white supremacy and hatred towards Jews, where they used an algorithm to scour the entire platform of Steam for instances of the Pepe Frog being used. They didn't do the deep dive of what it was being used for. They used the algorithm to just find out whether or not the emote or the icon was being used. Which, if anybody knows, if you hung out on Twitch or any major gaming platform at all, everybody uses the frog for anything. So basically, in their eyes, if you ever use the Pepe Frog for anything, then apparently you're an anti-Semite. Equivalent to that of the tiny mustache man from World War II. So yes, like in that, and from what I've seen, the ADL actually did receive taxpayer funding for this shit. In other words, your taxpayer dollars was going to a company who was designed to basically equate you to being a white supremacist, all because you use an emote that had nothing to do with it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like, the digging about this stuff and how deep this goes runs further than we think. This is just the surface level shit that they found so far. Again, whether or not you think the whole USA thing should be dismantled, blah, blah, like I'm not here to talk about that. That's not what I'm here for. But what I do think is important is the information that has come out in digging into that stuff, which I think is incredibly important no matter what side of the aisle you're on. Because had it not been dug into, we would have never found stuff like this and how it's getting funded. Now, Sweet Baby Inc. is a Canadian firm. And it's already been confirmed that they are indeed receiving a lot of money from the Canadian government. But I am willing to bet that there is a U.S. equivalent over here getting the same treatment. This also relates to things like a while back there was a company called Take This, and I'm pretty sure they're still alive today. And the idea of Take This was that they were supposed to be trying to combat basically hatred in video games, whether it be in online games, when you're playing games online and you're talking on voice chat and stuff like that. They call themselves trying to combat that. However, a lot of the suggestions they have made have bled over into things like Riot Games, for example, where now they have effectively a bot that literally monitors all of your voice chat between players, constantly being monitored and spied on when playing League of Legends, if you ever use voice chat. Because that is how much influence they have in regards to basically expressing how much hatred they have for the general gaming community. The level of distrust they have for us as gamers. To want to go that far, to have that level of control. And for what I've seen in my own research with this stuff, is that Take This did in fact receive government or taxpayer funds. Not a significant amount of taxpayer funds, but enough to have some sort of sway to do things like this. And at the very least, pay some of their employees. Under the guise of being a humanitarian effort. So that's what we're dealing with. That's the kind of shit that's coming out right now. And again, this is just me collating what I've found so far and what I've heard so far. I could still be missing a lot of details here because this stuff is still very fresh. But this goes to show you just how much the people that are in the industry, and especially in access media, think about you, us, video games, or video gamers in general. To them, we are the enemy, and they will go so far as to have the government label us as analogous to terrorists, to have that kind of sway. And they will use, whether it be government-funded networks or whatever it might be, to make things happen. Don't believe me? What if I told you that people like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian of Feminist Frequency, when the whole first Gamergate thing happened, they were allowed to speak at the United Nations about this issue? Still don't think there's government influence in this shit? Easy to turn a blind eye to this stuff. A lot of people say, well, why is this shouldn't be a big deal? It's just video games. Why do you care so much? Like, I would love for us to go back to a time where it's just video games, where it wasn't important because it's just a damn video game. I would love to go back to that time when no one cared, when video games were just seen as this nerdy thing that people do from time to time. I would love to go back to that time, but we are far past that point now. That was the golden era of video games. We are far past that. Video games as an industry is the most popular form of entertainment to date. It has far surpassed movies even. So no, it is no longer just video games. We've moved past that now. It's too late for that. I would love to go back to a time when it was, because those were indeed the best times, but we are past that now. That's why this shit is important. And it's because we're past that for the reason why you have so many people trying to get their hands and influence into video games. Like I said before, video games going mainstream was a mistake. And you're seeing what that mistake is in real time right now. Anyways, I am once again past my time for today's episode, so I think I will leave it there. Again, you'll probably see a lot more news coming out about this in the weeks to come, so long as this whole effort in the government to basically weed out unnecessary spending is underway. You'll probably be hearing a lot more stuff coming out, and I'm sure some of it, or not most of it, but a good portion of it will be related to video games in some way. So, like I said before, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We underestimate just how deep the rot runs in the industry. A lot of people had said that this stuff we trace all the way back to our government. And for the longest time, people dismissed them as being a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Only to find out years later, a decade later, that the conspiracy was indeed true. Now, a lot of people tend to relate this stuff all the way back to the first Gamergate in 2014. It is my belief, and I don't have a lot of evidence on this. This is just me spitballing here. This is my speculation that this shit runs back even further than the first Gamergate. The moment when the world declared that video games were a real cultural phenomenon. That tipping point when the industry exploded into what it is today. That's when it started. And we were just oblivious to it for all these years. She says we got to gatekeep anime, y'all. If you, I think it might be too late for anime as well. Unfortunately. Because this stuff has bled out beyond our government, even into other governments as well. Like even Japan is seeing some of this shit now. Even they're being influenced by some of it. So it's really that bad. It's really that bad. And it kind of undersells just how deep this stuff runs when you have places like Wikipedia that are running defense against Gamergate. Like I said before, you can go to Wikipedia right now, type in Gamergate, and they will tell you that it was a harassment campaign. But if you go to the Chinese version of Wikipedia and you ask about Gamergate, you'll get a very different answer. Perhaps the most objective one. In case you don't believe me. But anyways, that's all I got for now, folks. Thank you all for watching. Like I said, I don't like to get like political when it comes to stuff like this because I try to keep this stuff as apolitical as I possibly can. But this particular news, it's too big to ignore, and the level of influence it has and reach it has in the gaming industry is too big to ignore as well. Like it's inevitable that it has to be talked about. It's unfortunate, but that's where we are now. Because like I said before, that's how deep the rod goes. We thought it was just consultancy firms like Sweet Baby Inc. that was having this kind of influence. That was pushing the diversity and sexism and so on and so forth. But it's not. This runs deep to the government level. And I think we underestimate just how deeply entrenched it is in the industry. Hell, across the entire country. Like, I'm sure many of you here either have been through or know someone who has had to go through DEI training. To some degree. When you hear stories about places like Rockstar, for example, which have entire workshops dedicated to training its employees in DEI, where if you're white, where if you are a white developer, you are forced to acknowledge this so-called white privilege that you have. And you have to if you want to pass these workshops. It's just my company is too small. I have it. Luckily, you have it. There's a lot of them out there that do exactly this, and people are forced to go through these workshops. Like, it was leaked that this stuff was going on at Rockstar because, once again, there's a lot of developers at these companies that do not agree with this shit, and they can't speak out. So what do? They relay the information to content creators to point out. And someone did. Someone said, hey, check it out. Here's a workshop that we all have to go through at Rockstar for DEI training. Still can't figure out why people hate DEI yet? Still confused about why there's such vitriol and hatred towards it? Wonder where it's all coming from? Not sure why the about face about it was so hard and so quick and so swift. People do not like being told what to do. That has been a thing since the beginning of time. People do not like being told what to do. And here you are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to do exactly that. That is crazy to me. Anyways, that's all I got for now, folks. Thank you all for watching. Quite a hell of an episode that I have to get through, and I'll probably have to edit down some of this stuff, or edit down the beginning at least, and try to get it to a decent sized episode. But thank you all for watching. Appreciate you guys putting up with my ranting and raving and diving into a bunch of political shit that I really wish I didn't have to dive into, but that's where we are these days, unfortunately. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that regardless. I'll probably end up missing next week because I'm trying to get into the thing of making this a bi-weekly thing instead of a weekly thing. I think making it bi-weekly for now will be the best bet. I was actually going to skip this episode for this week because I wanted to start the bi-weekly thing now, but I already had all the information I needed for this episode ready to go, so I figured I may as well just do it now and then start the bi-weekly thing beginning next week. So that's the plan for that. But as always, thank you all for watching. Question everything. Don't take everything you hear at face value. Do your own research. And prepare for shit to get a lot worse, at least in terms of video games anyways. Prepare for a lot more news to come out as time goes on. As always, I'm your host, Corrupt Ronin. Thank you all for listening and watching. And I will see you guys during the next one. I'm out of here. Deuces. And fade to black.